This is the reading of list number 13 for the Holocaust Remembrance Project for WVU Hillel. Sila Rappaport, born unknown date, place of residence Kiev, died at Babi Yar, murdered by the Nazis in 1941 at the age of 8. Mania Singer, born 1935 in Berg, Hauke, place of death Toulouse, Wies, murdered by the Nazis in 1943 at the age of 8. Shloima Perelstein, born 1938 in Stara-Konstantinov, murdered by the Nazis in 1942 at the age of 4. Chaim Singer, born 1933, Zerardo, place of death unknown, date of death murdered by the Nazis unknown, age of 8. Sveta Zelenko, 1939, place of residence Brest, place of death unknown, date of death murdered by the Nazis in 1941 at the age of 2. Tomasz Ikovitz, born 1934 in Nyíregyháza, place of death Auschwitz, murdered by the Nazis in 1944 at the age of 10. Maltzy Schmelzer, born 1935 in Stanetsky, murdered in Stanetsky by the Nazis in 1941 at the age of 6. Tsalia Sorkina, born 1933 in Novo-Nikolaevka, where she was murdered by the Nazis in 1941 at the age of 8. Tanya Vahutsinskaya, born 1933 in Kiev, murdered by the Nazis at Babi Yar in 1941 at the age of 8. Ionia Blake, born 1938 in Korostkov, murdered in Lwów in 1942 at the age of 4 by the Nazis. Itzhak Mangil, born 1929 in Czechoslovakia, murdered by the Nazis at Auschwitz in 1942 at the age of 10. Itzia Weinstein, born 1940 in Kryvyi Rog, murdered at Krasino in 1942 at the age of 2. Semen Krasin, date of birth unknown, lived in Odessa and was murdered in Odessa by the Nazis at the age of 4. Manya Susel, 1937, born in Lubasuki, murdered by the Nazis in Mulzemezov Wolinski in 1942 at the age of 5. Izzy Baton, born 1940 in Saloniki, murdered by the Nazis at Auschwitz in 1943 at the age of 3. Etiel Borg, birth date unknown, lived in Zamość, murdered by the Nazis in Zamość at the age of 10. Yosef Perelmutter, birth date unknown, Wisnice, murdered in Wisnice at the age of 9. Fagi Gross, born 1937 in Veliki Berezny, murdered by the Nazis at Auschwitz in 1944 at the age of 7. Yakov Sokoryansky, born 1937 in Voroshilovgrad, murdered there by the Nazis in 1942 at the age of 5. Manya Ajaskovits, born 1939 in Tomatso Mazowiecki, murdered in Auschwitz by the Nazis in 1942 at the age of 3. Yevgenia Karabachinsky, born in 1933 in Kiev, murdered by the Nazis at Babi Yar in 1941 at the age of 8. Motel Vizgardisky, date of birth unknown, lived in Kono, died in Kono at the hand of the Nazis at age 6. Mary Krimgold, born in 1938 in Kashavate, was murdered there in 1941 by the Nazis at age 3. Shelia Kadej Gorodsky, born 1933 in Ternovka, murdered in Ternovka by the Nazis in 1942 at the age of 9. Izu Sterenberg, date of birth unknown, place of residence Nova Salita, place of death unknown, murdered at the age of 9 by the Nazis. Chaim Sonnenschein, born 1937 in Zelkil-Yid, murdered in Auschwitz by the Nazis in 1944 at the age of 7. Baracha Lukowicki, birth date unknown, lived in Zelicho, murdered at Treblinka in 1942 at the age of 9. Moishi Gewirtz, born in 1937 in Meroves, Harley, murdered in Auschwitz by the Nazis in 1944 at the age of 7. Fejka Jasinski, born 1934 in Ostrau Mazowka, murdered at Slonim in 1941 at the age of 8. Henrietta Weintraub, born 1940 in Volochisk, murdered in Volochisk in 1941 by the Nazis at the age of 1. Iraksa Uxgatel, birth date unknown, born in Kiev, murdered at Babi Yar by the Nazis at the age of 2. Alex Weigel, born in 1939 in Enschede, murdered at Auschwitz by the Nazis in 1942 at the age of 3. Ludovic Hayden, birth date unknown, residence unknown, murdered at Hersching in 1945 by the Nazis at the age of 7. Sora Plapla, birth date unknown, born in Władysław, murdered at Treblinka by the Nazis at the age of 3. Lumil Ostrowetsky, birth date unknown, born in Maljinica, murdered by the Nazis at Warsaw in 1942 at the age of 4. Hanela Koperwas, birth date unknown, born in Warsaw, place of death unknown, murdered by the Nazis at the age of 3. Bjorgi Steiner, born in 1937 in Esztergom, murdered at Auschwitz by the Nazis in 1944 at the age of 7. Ilya Weisblatt, born 1938 in Polonio, murdered in Babi Yar by the Nazis in 1942 at the age of 4. Ludwig Forkos, born in 1936, place unknown, murdered in Stanislawa in 1942 at the age of 6, murdered by the Nazis. Inka Leinwand, birth date unknown, lived in Lwów, died in Lwów, murdered in 1942 by the Nazis at the age of 4. Marguerite Latzowowicz, date of birth 1934, born in Dombasle, murdered by the Nazis at Auschwitz in 1944 at the age of 10. Judith Waldman, date of birth unknown, lived in Stropikov, murdered in Auschwitz by the Nazis at the age of 10. Ida Kotlar, born in 1935 in Kiev, murdered by the Nazis at Babi Yar in 1941 at the age of 6. Dawid Weinreb, born in 1935 in Rosnatow, murdered by the Nazis at Bolichow in 1942 at the age of 7. Katika Schwartz, birth date unknown, lived in Debrecen, murdered at Auschwitz by the Nazis at age 5. Simone Zawidowitz, born 1933 in Bordeaux, murdered at Auschwitz by the Nazis in 1943 at age 10. Sarah Wertheimer, birth date unknown, lived in Krakow, murdered by the Nazis at Bochnia in 1943 at the age of 3. Agi Weiss, born in 1934 in Raho, murdered at Auschwitz by the Nazis in 1944 at the age of 10. Rirke Thalenberg, birth date unknown, lived in Przemysl, murdered at Treblinka by the Nazis in 1943 at the age of 3. Manya Ulitskaya, born and died in Monastyrishka, murdered by the Nazis at 1942 at the age of 10. Hanig Sufarkas, born 1938 in Niyerbator, murdered at Auschwitz by the Nazis in 1944 at the age of 6. Haya Wachentime, born in Svalava, murdered at Auschwitz by the Nazis in 1944 at the age of 6. Georges Hirsch, born in 1935, residence unknown, murdered at Amiens in 1944 at the age of 9 by the Nazis. Tamas Ungar, born in 1938 in Tornalia, murdered at Auschwitz by the Nazis at age 6. Hillel Wagenfeld, born 1934 in Warsaw, place of death unknown, murdered by the Nazis in 1939 at the age of 5. Friedel Eisenberg, birth date unknown, place of residence unknown, murdered at Czestochowa at the age of 1 by the Nazis. Rachel Buchner, birth date unknown, resided in Chersono, place of death unknown, date of death unknown, murdered by the Nazis at age 7. Marian Aufrichtig, born in 1936 in Brno, murdered in Zamość in 1942 by the Nazis at age 6. Lilia Zosmanovskaya, born 1939 in Zimmerfall, died there in 1941 at the hand of the Nazis at age 2. Svetlana Steinberg, born 1932 in Kiev, murdered in Baba Yar in 1941 at the age of 9. Maurice Krausick, birth date unknown, reside in Paris, died in Auschwitz at the hand of the Nazis in 1942 at the age of 4. Lyalia Goltensvag, date of birth unknown, born and died in Dunayevsky in 1941 at the hand of the Nazis at age 1. Edith Jakubowicz, born 1934, place unknown, murdered by the Nazis at Auschwitz in 1944 at the age of 10. Schwachu Weinberger, birth date unknown, lived in Sigand, murdered by the Nazis at Auschwitz in 1944 at the age of 8. Tonya Corman, birth date unknown, lived in Lwów, murdered in Belzec by the Nazis in 1942 at the age of 3. Nellie Abkug, birth date unknown, lived in Oberton, place of death unknown, murdered by the Nazis in 1943 at the age of 8. Joseph Cardos, birth date unknown, lived in Kiskeras, murdered at Auschwitz by the Nazis at age 2. Perelka Zaustrom, born 1935 in Woschnitz, murdered at Zaklichin by the Nazis in 1942 at the age of 7. Zhuji Chrysler, born 1943 in Neregaza, murdered in Auschwitz by the Nazis in 1944 at the age of 1. Ella Kuznetsova, born in 1933 in Leningrad, murdered at Chereya in 1941 at the age of 8. Leah Mamina, born 1939 in Polotsk, murdered in Polotsk by the Nazis in 1941 at the age of 2. Israel Horowitz, born 1937 in Nagyvarad, murdered at Auschwitz by the Nazis in 1944 at the age of 7. Junio Uric, born 1941 in Lwów, place of death unknown, murdered by the Nazis in 1943 at the age of 2. Miklos Josevits, born 1942 in Moran Moziget, murdered at Auschwitz in 1944 by the Nazis at the age of 2. Etel Kosyanik, born 1940 in Kamenka, place of death unknown, murdered by the Nazis in 1942 at the age of 2. Yocheved Stein, born 1941 in Sazregan, murdered in Auschwitz by the Nazis in 1944 at the age of 4. Judith Kinks, born 1943 in Komorom, murdered in Auschwitz in 1944 by the Nazis at the age of 1. Sammy Matarazzo, born 1937 in Saloniki, murdered in Auschwitz at the age of 6, date unknown. Yakov Kamelman, birth date unknown, lived in Berdichev, place of death unknown, murdered by the Nazis in 1942 at the age of 10. Miklos Kitier, born in 1935, place of residence unknown, murdered at Auschwitz in 1944 at the age of 9. Rebecca Litchi, date of birth unknown, lived in Didymotcon, murdered in Birkenau by the Nazis in 1943 at the age of 8. Wolf Michelson, born 1934 in Piotrkow, murdered at Treblinka by the Nazis in 1942 at the age of 8. Gisela Kremer, birth date unknown, lived in Rapadia, murdered in Auschwitz by the Nazis in 1944 at the age of 8. Yaneshka Duchoni, date of birth 1940, born in Trezeno, murdered at Auschwitz at the age of 4. Menachem Konotopsky, birth date unknown, born and died in Chomsk at the hand of the Nazis in 1941 at the age of 2. Hindel Schickman, born 1933, lived and died in Sloko, murdered in 1942 by the Nazis at the age of 9. Mary Schultz, born in 1932 in Topolkany, murdered at Auschwitz by the Nazis at the age of 5. Meyer Moskal, born in 1933, lived in Kamenets-Podolsky, where he died at the hand of the Nazis in 1942 at the age of 9. Itzhak Yakubovics, born in 1941 in Satmar, murdered at Auschwitz by the Nazis in 1944 at the age of 3. Riza Kohn, birth date unknown, lived in Lodz, murdered at Treblinka by the Nazis in 1942 at the age of 10. Zygmunt Rosenkrantz, born in 1941 in Cologne-Meja, murdered at Belzec in 1942 by the Nazis at the age of 1. Sonny Weiss, birth date unknown, lived in Dindesti, murdered at Birkenau by the Nazis in 1944 at the age of 8. Gino Lorenz, born in 1936 in Samambethli, murdered at Auschwitz, date unknown, by the Nazis at age 8. Halinka Rosen, 1937, born and died in Warsaw at the hand of the Nazis in 1942 at the age of 5. Jakov Moskowitz, born in 1936 in Lepeka Polyana, murdered by the Nazis at Auschwitz in 1944 at the age of 8. Fira Kemmel, born in 1938 in Odessa, died in Odessa at the hand of the Nazis in 1942 at the age of 3. Lidochka Neponchekaya,